Have you ever wondered what happens in the final, chilling moments of the world's most powerful dictators? We're going to dive deep into just that, how their iron grips were ultimately and often brutally broken. You know, there's this really powerful observation that just cuts right to the heart of this whole thing. Dictators rarely get a clean exit. There's no quiet retirement. Their endings are almost always a chaotic, violent reflection of the very systems they built. So that brings us to the big question, right? Why is this a pattern? We're going to go beyond the sensational headlines and really try to understand the structural reasons why these dramatic falls from power happen with such, well, unsettling consistency. And here's the core idea of our whole discussion. These chaotic endings, they aren't just historical accidents. Nope, they are the predictable, almost inevitable outcome of systems built on fear, personality, and the total destruction of any institution that could possibly offer a peaceful way out. Okay, first up, let's talk about two dictators whose power really relied on public spectacle. We're going to see what happened when the audience, so to speak, finally turned on them. You have to think about Benito Mussolini's regime as basically one giant performance. His power was all about projecting this image of invincibility through these huge rallies and powerful Roman-inspired imagery. It wasn't just about repression, it was pure spectacle. But as World War II started to turn against him, that whole performance just fell apart. He got arrested, tried to flee in disguise, and was ultimately caught by partisans. And just look at this timeline. His end was swift, brutal, and incredibly public. And this is where it gets really fascinating. The public display of his body wasn't just about revenge. It was a deliberate, symbolic act. They were flipping his own political theater on its head. The very crowds that once chanted his name were now witnesses to his ultimate humiliation, completely stripping away that image he'd worked so hard to build. Now, let's jump over to Romania's Nicolae Ceaușescu. I mean, what a story. He thought he was giving just another one of his speeches to an adoring crowd, but the illusion of support completely crumbled. In real time, broadcast live on television for the whole world to see as the people started to boo and jeer. And the speed of his collapse is just stunning. From the moment he and his wife were captured after they tried to flee, it took just 3 days for their entire regime to end in an execution. 3 days. Think about that. You know, their trial wasn't some long, drawn-out legal process. No way. It was a rushed, messy affair because the new government knew that any delay was a huge risk. It just goes to show how authoritarian legitimacy can basically evaporate overnight once that apparatus of fear stops working. The system that was built to protect the leader, it becomes totally irrelevant. All right, so now let's look at what happens when dictators go a step further and completely dismantle the state itself, leaving this massive power vacuum that ends up defining their final moments. Okay, this is a great comparison because it shows two totally different paths to the same kind of brutal end. You've got Gaddafi in Libya, who erased all state institutions, and then you've got Saddam in Iraq, who built his power through them. And man, their endings could not reflect those choices more perfectly. With Gaddafi, it was pure chaos. And why? Well, because there was nothing left to control it. He had spent decades making sure there were no rules, no courts, no institutions, nothing that could manage a transition. So what was left? Mob justice. As it says here, vengeance replaced law. His end was a direct reflection of the vacuum he created. Now, Saddam, on the other hand, a completely different story. He was captured, put on trial, and formally executed. The guy who ruled through absolute fear ended his life under the authority of a legal system he once totally dominated. His power just evaporated the second he was yanked out of his command structure. So look, it's easy to see these as just crazy random stories from history, but they're not. They actually reveal these clear, repeating patterns and how these super personalized authoritarian systems are basically designed to fail. Across all these different cases, you see this consistent 3-step process. First, the dictator gets more and more isolated, surrounded by yes-men. Then, the loyalty of the people around them starts to get a little shaky. The elites, the military, they all start hedging their bets. And then finally, step 3, the collapse accelerates. Once things start to weaken, they weaken with a speed that shocks everyone, especially the dictator himself. So why does any of this matter? Because it teaches us this really crucial lesson. These endings feel insane because the systems themselves were incredibly brittle the whole time. When you concentrate all the power in one person, when you get rid of anyone who disagrees with you, and when you replace actual institutions with personal loyalty, well, there are just no buffers. There's nothing to stop the fall when reality finally comes knocking. And that brings us to our final, really powerful conclusion about the self-destructive nature of all this unchecked authority. At the end of the day, the real takeaway is this: the chaotic endings aren't some weird exception to the rule. They are the rule. They are the logical conclusion. When you build an entire state around one single individual, that system is actually designed to collapse the moment that person is gone. It's a feature, not a bug. So we'll leave you with this final thought. The pursuit of absolute, total control is, in the end, a self-defeating prophecy. The final chapter of tyranny is always written the same way, and it always has the same message. Absolute power cannot escape its own violent, absolute end.